Much for tuning in to the Cloud Native podcast. Here's a question for you. How do you know if your application is healthy and performing as expected? Many might say it's by monitoring metrics like memory and CPU usage, ensuring the disk for storing state isn't full, and checking that it responds to requests quickly and that it doesn't crash. While these external metrics are crucial, they often only indicate that something is wrong without telling us what exactly is causing an issue. And observability, yes, I agree, is a mess. But because of so many moving parts, but open telemetry turns it into a rewarding experience. So let me take a moment to introduce my guest who have been deeply involved in all things observability. She will help us guide us through the current landscape and some conference reviews. A quick intro of my guest. Adriana Villala is a senior software staff developer advocate, helping companies achieve reliability greatness through observability, SRE, and DevOps practices. Before her current role, she managed a platform engineering team and an observability practice team at Tukau. And Adriana has worked at various large-scale enterprises as an individual contributor and leader, including Bank of Montreal, Ceridian, and Accenture. Adriana is a blogger and host of Geeking Out podcast, and also a running CNCF and HashiCorp ambassador. With all this introduction, I go straight to Adriana. Thank you very much for your first episode on the Cloud Native podcast. And can you give us a quick intro, because I've done it? Is something new you have want to add on it?
Oh, I think you've covered it all. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be here.
Great. So before I actually start some of the observability things, let us give us some of your skills. I have seen some of your Instagram account on wall climbing. Let us know how I've been actually doing it and some of the skill you share with us on some wall climbing techniques.
Oh yeah, so I started rock climbing back in 2002 because it was something that I wanted to try. So I went to like a local climbing gym with a bunch of friends and I fell in love with it. I think the following day I went out and bought my own climbing shoes. And I've been doing it ever since. And there's like a couple of different types of rock climbing. So there's like the rock climbing that everyone thinks of, which is, you're like wearing a harness and you've got a rope and you're, several meters off the ground. And so that's what I started off doing. But so my husband, my daughter, and I all climb. And when my daughter was 3, we're like, oh, let's take her to the climbing gym and see if she likes it. But at the time, like, there's no way we could like all 3 of us climb if we were doing the rope climbing. So we tried this other type of climbing called bouldering, where you're a few meters off the ground, no rope, no harness, just you and a big mat and your courage. So that's how we all got into bouldering, and I fell in love with that kind of rock climbing, and that's what I've been doing ever since, I guess, for the last 13 years. And for me, it's a real source of like it provides me a source of like inner strength, because it's, like I have ADHD, so my mind is very chaotic, and so the bouldering just, it's such an intense workout that you can't think of anything but getting to the top. And also it's like it's a form of problem solving, because there's like set problems. They're actually called bouldering problems. So there's like, you're supposed to follow like color coded holds up the wall, and you're not supposed to touch the holds of any other color. And you're supposed to figure out how to get to the top. And how you get to the top is different from, say, like, my husband and my daughter and I will climb the same problem, but we all will not necessarily do it the same way, because we have different body types. We have different amounts of flexibility, different height. So it's like a real personal journey. So it really like kind of helps you focus on yourself as well. So that's why I really love climbing. And so I have this habit of like, every time I visit a new city, whether it's for a vacation or a conference, I always go to the local bouldering gym and check it out. And it's just so much fun.
Absolutely. And I think I totally agree with all the things you have said. And I think one thing I really like about wall climbing or rock climbing is that it's something of observability layer. You
Oh
pick a
my,
spot like last time you touches this, and the next time, oh no, I my God, I actually reach actually a 1 centimeter higher or 1 meter
yeah.
higher. So it's one of the support where observability is straight into it.
It's so true. Yeah, because every time, like even as you're failing, going up the wall, every time you go up, you learn a little bit more information that will help you get higher.
Absolutely, and I think that's the one of the thing I love about this game. And before we start the main topic, what is your favorite athlete in this sport?
Oh my God. So, Janja Garnbret, she is Slovenian. She just won the gold medal at the Paris Olympics. Oh my God, she is like a force to be reckoned with. I have never seen anyone climb so freaking well. She's amazing.
Yes, absolutely. He's been incredibly wonderful, successful athlete in this game. So let us talk about your passion, your main topic point these days, and some of your conferences you often visit. And I see all the things related to observability. So give us a very quick overview of what is Opentelemetry today.
So, Opentelemetry, for a little bit of background, so before Opentelemetry, there was like two sort of main competing projects for standardizing on telemetry. One was Open Census, the other one was Open Tracing. And I want to say in around 2019, a decision was made to like basically merge those two projects into one, and that became Opentelemetry. So Opentelemetry, it's a CNCF project. It's open source, vendor neutral, and it's this observability framework for instrumenting, generating, collecting, and exporting telemetry data. And the nice thing about it is, like, as I mentioned, it's vendor neutral. Um, all of the major observability vendors are behind OpenTelemetry. So there are contributors from pretty much all the major vendors to OpenTelemetry, which is what I love about the community. I basically get to work with competitors every day, but I don't think of them as competitors. They're just friends. We're all working towards the same goal, towards doing the same thing. And I think it's really important that this is happening because that way, like, first of all, we're speaking the same language. All of these vendor tools are ingesting the same type of data. So then what ends up differentiating them at the end is how is it that the data is interpreted? And so basically then it really becomes like up to you as the consumer. Okay, is this interpreting the data in a way that is meaningful to me? And so that's how these various tools end up differentiating themselves. And the thing that I also want to mention that I love about the open telemetry community is because like they really make an effort for the vendor neutrality. It means that, you know, even like in the past, for example, like I wrote a blog post where I'm like, oh, this is what it looks like to like send data to this vendor, and they're like, well, like we really want to keep it vendor neutral. So if you want to use like an open source project to show what the telemetry looks like, that's totally cool, but we really need to keep it vendor neutral. And I appreciate that they do that, and I appreciate that they do it politely, because that's important, and I think that's what keeps folks contributing to the project.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is one of the project. If you look at the CNCF leaderboard, this is one of the top project in the CNCF that is widely adopted across a variant different organization, and the list is quite extensively huge. And right now, as we speaking, remember back in 2023, when actually delve into it, there's not a lot, very few. There are languages that has some hurdles when you adopt the open telemetry, but this is all solved incredibly fast, as you mentioned, because of the great community support behind it. And as you mentioned during the conversation, there's an open tracing and open consensus, which has two different separate layers, and we merge them together to form a standard that actually all the organization can use, and they can bring is basically a specification for observability, and all the vendors will adopt to that specification and adds more values into it as well. So Every time I look at the CNCF board, it's surprising me. Oh no, it's Kubernetes is not well adopted, but it's open telemetry. And that really excites me of some of the journey this project actually has took for a very long time. So I think you actually been a part of the team Lightstep, who is now from ServiceNow right now. And it's been one of the vendor of the open telemetry. So can you speak some of the things that this company has adopted to increase some of the simplicity to bring into the observability for the platform engineering teams?
So when I joined, it was Lightstep, which is an observability vendor, and they were acquired by ServiceNow, I think 3 years into the acquisition. So then I believe Lightstep was then rebranded as ServiceNow Cloud Observability. And one of the cool things about Lightstep, the original Lightstep product and cloud observability as it continues, is basically it's an OTel native product. So before, like even before OTel, there were a bunch of observability vendors out there, each ingesting their own data format. They had their own libraries and whatnot. But then when OpenTelemetry came about, they were either able to ingest OpenTelemetry format natively, and the OpenTelemetry format is called OTLP, or OpenTelemetry Protocol, or there was this thing called an exporter, which basically converted from OTLP to that native format, so that it became basically a stopgap until if the vendor chose to, they could convert to ingest that data format natively. So Lightstep was one of those, I would say, original OTLP native products, and it's been cool to see that a lot of the observability vendors out there now ingest OTLP natively. So that just goes to show, like, I think a lot of it really just goes to show, like, the power of open telemetry, that vendors are taking it seriously. Like, this is one of those things that's here to stay. Because I think that was when I got into open telemetry initially, and it was before I joined ServiceNow. I was managing an observability practices team at Two Cows, and this was back in 2021. And it was interesting because at the time, like, open telemetry was pretty new. And I was trying to, like, pivot the entire observability direction for the organization. And so they were using open tracing. And I'm like, well, open telemetry is newer. Like, we should move in that direction. And two things were kind of funny. They're like, yes, we use open tracing. I'm like, I know, but open tracing is not equal to open telemetry. Now, there's backwards compatibility between open tracing and open telemetry, open census and open telemetry. And that was done by design, right? Because if you're already using it, we don't want to make it so that it's like, we want to lower the barrier to entry. But so that was one aspect of it. But the other aspect was, open telemetry was so new at the time. I think when I joined, not metrics, traces, which was the first signal that was worked on, wasn't even in GA. So this was like in the summer, fall of 2021, traces weren't in GA. It became GA, I think, in the winter of 2021. And so I'm having to sit there at this organization telling people, like, trust me, this is going to be a big deal. It's gonna happen. And everyone's, like, super skeptical, of course, right? It's like, I'm sure if I were in their position, I'd be like, but what I did was I had started making friends in open telemetry at that point. So I talked to Liz Fong Jones and Ted Young, who are both super involved with open telemetry. And Ted's still super involved. Liz is a little bit less involved. But I said, and we were evaluating both. And Ted is actually my coworker, so we were evaluating Lightstep and Honeycomb at the time. And I'm like, look, let's put, like, vendor stuff aside. Like, are you okay if I got both of you to come to talk to the engineers at Two Cows and just answer their questions and kind of ease their concerns about open telemetry? And to my surprise, they actually said yes. I was like, first of all, I'm like, oh my God, like, because I look up to them so much. I'm like, oh my God, total fangirl moment, right? And secondly, they actually agreed to this. Like, my mind was blown. And it was funny too, because when I brought them on, I told my team, I'm like, listen, we need some plant questions in case the conversation runs dry. Because I'm like, oh my God, what is this? What if this thing falls flat on its face, right? And nobody asks questions. But fortunately, like I think we had them for an hour and the engineers were just asking away. And I was so pleased because it really meant that they were genuinely interested. And I think at the end of the day, it really calmed down their fears. So it, it made me really happy. And I'm happy to see too that like, my thing that I said in 2021, I'm like, trust me, this is going to be a big deal. It was like, yes, it came to fruition.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that this is you made a very great bet, because if you look at the observability for a very long time, we have different toolings to instrument our code. And this is the biggest challenge. I remember back then I worked for an application that was written in the front end in Angular, and the back end is the .NET, and then the caching layer, and then there is a data translation layer for the DBs. Every time you push into the production and make sure we have observability metrics flowing through the different system, we absolutely have very chaotic situation, because Angular accept the different instrumentation of coding, and then the backend has the different instrumentation, and all the tools are for the front end tools are different from the backend tools, and the databases are different. So it's a very skeptical world, and sometimes if there's some metrics we doesn't even comes out from the production setup, who is responsible for that. And Opentelemetry is bridging all that, because you have one instrumentation that you actually code or knows, and then it's up to the scraping point to push to use that data for your beneficial needs. So I think there's no bad bet in any means in Opentelemetry, and the way it's actually progresses in 3 years, it's incredible journey, because in the other CNCF projects, I remember in open service, there's an interface called Open Service Mesh Interface that is not quite being adopted like the Opentelemetry, and bunch of other CRI runtimes, CSI runtimes are not actually become the way we want it to be. But the Opentelemetry actually beats everyone with that interface. So I think it's greatly that's all the vendor actually now supporting them specification, because otherwise then being a developer or being the DevOps, my job is absolutely horrific of
Yeah.
all the time fighting with all these kind of tools as well. So the next question is quite of some futuristic question, but I know there are some people, there are some organization having some legacy system in their organization setup. So how can organization overcome complexity in setting up open telemetry when dealing with legacy systems?
Yeah, that one's a little bit tricky, and especially because so there's like different types of legacy systems, right? There could be like legacy Java systems that are just like a really old version of Java. And then you've got like legacy like mainframes, right? And interestingly enough, I want to say I think there's like now a mainframes group for OpenTelemetry, because as it turns out, mainframes need some love too. So that's been really cool to see. And even another one, so when I was at 2Cows, there was like a lot of Perl happening. And I remember at the time there was like no open telemetry for Perl. And I remember we had even opened an issue with OpenTelemetry saying, hey, any interest in like any Perl for OpenTelemetry? And oddly enough, surprisingly and delightfully so, it looks like there's been a little bit of movement in this open telemetry for Perl. I subscribe to that issue, and every so often I'll get messages. I don't know how much traction there has been, but it's interesting that like people are interested enough in working on it. Um, as for the other legacy stuff, like just older versions of languages, that becomes a little bit tricky because I think in that case, like if I'm not mistaken, like the language specific SDKs and APIs, like they support like certain versions of the language. So you do need to be on a certain version of that language in order to reap the benefits of open telemetry, and especially for the languages that support the auto instrumentation. If you're not on that version, those languages, of the libraries, you're not going to be able to take advantage of that. So if it's something that you want to use, then especially for the instrumentation, like the language specific instrumentation, like being able to add traces and take advantage of OpenTelemetry logs, then I think you'll need to upgrade. And that's like a whole can of worms, right? Because organizationally, like these large organizations with like old legacy systems, we know that these things take time and a lot of effort. So that might be a little bit tricky. So I wonder then in that case, for OpenTelemetry, they can probably take advantage at least of gathering like some infrastructure metrics at the very least. It doesn't give you that full picture for observability because the metrics, as you said, are just like one part of the picture, and really it's the traces that kind of really help you dig in and understand what's going on. But I mean, it's a step at least that organizations can take, short of like upgrading their like language runtimes and whatnot.
Yes, absolutely. And I think if somebody is using still the legacy system, I know there are so many choices to use OpenTelemetry, even though it's not actually been natively integrated into your legacy system, but there are some translation layer in between them. So I think if you're living in the containers world, you can push some of the data that need observability, you can spun up in the containers and the rest of it wherever it was. And if you need some infrastructure layer where you need to dig in some information, you need to become a new stack, adopt a new stack, and then start scraping data out of it. I think hopefully there are some more options today than it was before, but I think it's going to be a tricky, and sometime this need careful consideration of which businesses you are actually. So the next question is, I want to know, how does an ecosystem around OpenTelemetry look like? I know it's been quite extensive and it's been huge. You have support for Java, Python, JavaScript, and so many languages. Cloud provider, Azure, GCP, Google. Prometheus and Grafana for the backend and analytic integration, Jacker and Zipkins, ELK, Splunk with Datadog, and you have service mesh integration with Istio and Linkerd. And then for the instrumentation library, we have Spring Boot, Express.js, Java, and bunch of others. And for the third-party tooling, like for the vendors, we can speak about New Relic, Honeycomb, and Lightstep. So what have you recently seen more valuable addition into this ecosystem?
I know there's been one thing that's been really interesting is I think there's a little bit more attention getting put in the mobile space, because after all, like we're on our phones like such a long part of the day. And so I think the community has seen that there is a need for having that observability of their phone apps. And so as a little sidebar, earlier in the summer, so I'm one of the maintainers of the OpenTelemetry end user SIG. And one of the things that we do is we connect end users with each other. We also we host a number of events. So one of them is OTel Q&A, where we sit down with a practitioner and they tell us about how they use OpenTelemetry in real life. We have OTel in practice, which is basically like someone gives a presentation on a cool OTel related thing. And we had earlier in the summer a couple of folks from this mobile observability company called Embrace. And they came to talk to us about how it is that actually they used OpenTelemetry in their own product, which has been really cool. But also how they have made some contributions, like they're part of one of the OTel groups and making some upstream contributions in that area. So I think that's a really exciting area, because as I said, like so many people use their mobile phones. So we need to have that kind of observability into our mobile phones, mobile apps, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think we live in that world where people can start writing code from the phone as well. So if they
Yeah.
have some observability, you can actually in wherever they are, they can make a quick fixes by looking at what actually need to be fixed. So this is a very interesting space to be in as well. And also, I think the open telemetry is might be going towards adding some support for the WASM. I hope there are some integration in place in the near future. And also, on the same topic, on the eBPF layer, where we're actually scraping some data from the kernel call as it happening, do you see some of the thing we can actually like we can use some unification in the kernel layer, that wherever we are actually we can pick those up and start doing some interesting stuff with that information.
Yeah, definitely. And I think eBPF has like really grown in the last little while. Like there's a lot of interest in it in OpenTelemetry, like even as far as like talks, yeah, for Observability Day and at KubeCon. There's like eBPF is definitely a hot topic, and I think it's one of those like really useful and cool technologies that gives us that little like extra bit of insight that we wouldn't have had otherwise, which is exciting. Another one that's really cool that just came out is so we know about like the traditional open telemetry signal as or the observability signals, the three pillars as it may, the traces, metrics, logs. One new open telemetry signal that came out is profiling, which is really cool. And that's very exciting. And I think we're going to start seeing some talks at future KubeCons on profiling as well, to give us like that extra bit of insight into our applications, the what is actually going on in here, which is very, very cool.
Yes, absolutely. And you actually talk about KubeCon, and I know there's a co-located event happening all the time in KubeCon, and I think we're actually heading towards 2 months from now exactly, or 2.5 months from now, of the KubeCon Salt Lake. So is there an open telemetry specific conference happening in Salt Lake?
So at least for the last several years, they've had what's called Observability Day, which is one of the co-located events. So that is happening again at KubeCon in Salt Lake City. So
Oh, that's great. I definitely add the description to the people, because I think there's some schedule already in place for who will be talking about some of the learning session from their organization. So speaking of viewers' interest in the KubeCon, and you have been actually not just in the KubeCon, in some of the KCD events you have been a part of, and you're the active member of this whole observability layer inside the CNCF. So what are the best places to learn open telemetry if you actually been visiting or touring in some of the places for the KubeCon? So what are those some best places?
ooh, um, so I would say if you're at a KubeCon, the last couple of KubeCons, we had something called the Hotel Observatory, which is a booth where you can find a bunch of the hotel maintainers, contributors, just chilling and sitting there and answering your questions. So the last KubeCon, we actually tried to do something a little bit more organized, where not only could you come and ask questions about observability, but also we had a couple of feedback sessions. So like, for example, we scheduled like feedback sessions for anyone who want to give feedback to the docs. They could sit down for an in-person meeting and have a conversation, and then the folks who are maintaining the hotel docs can come back and take that feedback and try to incorporate it, kind of thing. So that is a great place to learn more about observability. Obviously, like so at KubeCon, there's an observability track, which is exciting. And like I said, there's the Observability Day co-located event. Um, as well, Open Source Summit is a great place where you can learn about observability as well. There isn't a specific observability track necessarily, but there are observability talks. I'm actually going to be at Open Source Summit in Vienna in September, giving a talk about observability. So I think you can always find people talking about observability in various conferences. But I would say KubeCon is definitely the place, because there's like definite dedicated streams to observability, and you can. This is the place where you can actually find and connect with the various open telemetry maintainers, which is really exciting, because like I work with so many of them on a regular basis, and we see each other on Zoom. And to be able to meet in real life has been absolutely awesome, and especially a lot of also the end users that we interact with, who, you know, we wouldn't be where we are without the end users, right? They're the ones that are using OpenTelemetry out in the wild. Like, yes, you can integrate OpenTelemetry in your product, but if no one's using it, so it's so cool to meet those people and really like see their enthusiasm around OpenTelemetry, which is very heartening.
Yes, absolutely. And another place to learn observability is the Geek Out podcast as well, where Adriana actually hosts and invites some of the very wonderful expert from other domains as well, not just observability, but other domain as well. So before I let you go, give us some of the glimpses of how this actually started and what the future episode could look like, or when it will be coming in the near future on your podcast.
Yeah, so I started geeking out last year. So before that, I had this podcast through work called On Call Me Maybe with my coworker Ana Margarita Medina, and we had two wonderful seasons. But then the podcast ended, and I'm like, "Ah, I really like podcasting, so I'm just going to start my own." And I was talking with my daughter, and she's like, "I can help you if you want." So she edits the episodes for me. And so I've been just like, I've met so many people over the last couple of years that I've been a developer advocate. And I've only been a developer advocate for 2 years. Like, I've been in tech for 24 years, but only a developer advocate for two. And it's been wild, like reaching out to people and inviting them to come on the show. So I think my most memorable guests, I had Kelsey Hightower on my podcast, and that one was a cool story because I met him at KubeCon in Chicago last year, and I was waiting in line for his book signing, and I was wearing a mask, and I had a geeking out sticker stuck to my mask. And he's like, "What's geeking out?" I'm like, "Oh, that's my podcast." He's like, "I can be on your podcast if you want." I'm like, "What?" You can't be serious. Like, bucket list. And so I got in touch with him after KubeCon, and he replied right away, and we set something up, and he was on my podcast. And I've had other cool guests like Charity Majors, as well. I've had Hazel Weekly on, and Hazel has some really cool thoughts and ideas about platform engineering, and she's absolutely brilliant. I've had Jennifer Riggins, who is a tech reporter, and she had some wonderful, wonderful insights about, things in tech and sustainability in tech. Abby Bangser is another one who also is a great voice in the platform engineering realm. And we took a summer break, and now we're going to be returning on September 3rd with a lineup of new guests. So I'm really excited. And the first guest of the season is going to be Liz Fong Jones.
Awesome. Wonderful. Thanks for sharing all these details. I will include the link in the description. Or also, I think there's something popping up in the screen. So you go check that out. There's a very, very web resources for that. And thanks, Adriana, actually working on some of the content for the community purpose as well. And thanks for actually joining me on this podcast. I actually met you on the Kubernetes birthday, and I become a big fan of all of your work, and hoping to cover all of these observability a learning session with you so people can actually make some improved decision on some of the tech stack they're actually working on. So I can recap the whole episode on this word. Observability sometime often neglected because of its overwhelming nature with so many moving parts, but it's a design choice that can reduce ton of cost because of the data we can collect to predict what could go wrong and that deserve immediate intervention. And thankfully, to Opentelemetry, it's here to simplify things and give us a rewarding experience. And with the community sport, and with Adriana's wonderful podcast and all the work, we can assume this fascinating space will be actually becoming a very, very, very useful space for a lot of the organization. With that, thank you very much, Adriana, for sharing your time with this podcast. And hopefully, we will be we're inviting you again in the near future. After might be the KubeCon Salt Lake.